My name is John Reeves, and this is the Truth as Medicine podcast. Before we get started, I'd like to begin with a little land acknowledgement. Currently coming to you from Pasadena, California. And we acknowledge that the land we are on today is the traditional homeland of the Tongva people, also known as the Gabrielino Tongva. We honor their elders past and present, and we recognize the Tongva community's enduring relationship to this land. So, why this space exists? People for a very long time have been telling me to do a podcast. I guess I have lived a very interesting life, and you're going to get to hear about that a little bit today. But why this podcast exists is because for those of you that don't know, I've been in the healthcare industry probably the past 20, 22 years. And as hard as I try to get out of the tribal health world, it keeps pulling me back. And I've struggled for a long time with why that is. But maybe during the course of this, together, we might figure that out. So, this first podcast, I'd like to start with my story. And in my script, my story is only supposed to take between 2 to 7 minutes. But every time I tell the story, it takes roughly 40 minutes. So, it might be an awful long, drawn out destination here or journey. Whenever I start with a new organization, I always start with a presentation as I'm integrating or interfacing with the team, and it's called John's Journey. I always start this story in Vietnam. And for context, I was born in 1980. So people usually look at me and they're like, man, this guy wasn't in Vietnam. But the story that I tell was kind of teed up maybe 15 years before I was born. So I don't know, my math might be off. I think Vietnam was in the late 60s. But anyway, the story has to do with my father. And a lot of my path has been driven indirectly by him in particular, which is kind of interesting because I am the third. He's a junior. His dad was the first, the original. But also on my mom's side of the family, there's plenty of Johns. So, I mean, I probably have the most boring parents ever. But in Vietnam, my dad tells a story about he was a pilot his whole career, and he flew fixed wing aircraft as well as helicopters in Vietnam. And my dad was born down south, so he was a racist, just plain and simple. But the story goes, he was flying in and out, or he got the call to lay down some support and go pick up some special forces guys that were in the midst of a firefight. And I think a lot of them did end up getting wiped out, but there was this one gentleman in particular that my dad flew in and they laid down some fire, had enough of a clearing to go pick this guy up. And this gentleman, an African American gentleman, he says to my dad, thank you so much for saving my life. And my dad, the asshole that he is, says, I only saved you because of what you're wearing right now. And he grabbed his shoulder, and it was the fatigues that they wear, basically saying, we're on the same team. That's the only way that I saved you. He also goes on to say, if I had known that you were a black guy when the call came in, I probably wouldn't have saved you. And the guy looks at my dad and says, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but maybe one day you'll be fortunate enough to have a son that will marry an African American woman, and that might change your perspective a little bit. So, fast forward to November 8th, 1980. I was born at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, to my mom, who was a flight attendant at the time, and my dad, who was a commercial pilot. And I spent maybe the first 3 or 4 years of my life down in Memphis, really kind of in the farmland, which is now like Collierville, Germantown, Tennessee area, if you're familiar with that. But my dad tells a second story about why we moved from Memphis, Tennessee. He says, as he was driving around, the elementary school that we were going to go to, again, I was about 4 years old, so getting ready to start preschool. They misspelled grammar on the grammar school sign. And my dad didn't think I would get a very good education. And I'm sure he had some career progression, but they decided to move us to to just southwest of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. But before that, as he was getting ready to sell his house, he was going to sell his house to a black friend of his. And I use that term friend loosely. He was another pilot, I guess, or maybe he worked for the airline. But when the community found out my dad was going to sell that house to that gentleman, they burnt crosses in our yard. There were 3 crosses that were burning. And you have to understand Memphis, Tennessee is probably still goes on to this day a little bit. They had the Ku Klux Klan that was pretty active down there. And my dad ended up telling the guys, like, man, I can't in good faith sell this house to you. Even though the guy said that's fine. He'd been dealing with it his whole life. So they went ahead and sold the house to somebody else, and we picked up and moved to South Dakota. And my dad, the man that he is, you'll notice a theme in the places that we've lived growing up. And I moved around quite a little bit, but he didn't like to pay taxes too much, which is why we lived in Tennessee, which is why we moved to South Dakota. Also, why we were looking at moving to Alaska or outside the country, later on in life. But anyway, we moved to South Dakota. And I spent the majority of my time till I was a sophomore in high school in a very rural area. Southeastern South Dakota is an interesting place. It's a lot of farmland, a lot of corn. The town that we lived just outside of, my dad ended up buying a little farm and he rebuilt a house with his two hands, but it was a very rural area. I think the town that we went to school in was a little town by the name of Chancellor, South Dakota. There was only maybe about 115 people that lived there. So very rural. And my dad commuted out of Minneapolis during that time. But fast forward sophomore in high school, and I was an athlete growing up, played a lot of basketball, ran a lot of track. Sophomore year, we decided to up and move again because my dad got a promotion. He was going to be flying 747s overseas. So we looked at Alaska a little bit. Alaska was a little bit far, but I think he actually ended up flying out of Anchorage for all of those routes. But we ended up moving to Idaho, and I kind of bounced around Idaho a little bit until I graduated high school. When I graduated high school, I decided to go right into college. I actually graduated high school with a 1.8 GPA. I like telling that story because I did not spend a lot of time in class. And all of my teachers pretty much said, "You're not going to amount to anything." And they could see me now. But anyway, 1.6 GPA. I actually graduated early from a high school, Skyline High School in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And the reason why I graduated early wasn't because I was very good educationally. It was because I had bounced around to so many different places. I had enough credits to cash it in on the last quarter. But immediately coming out of high school, I decided to go into college and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I either wanted to be an accountant or I wanted to be a doctor. And you might look and say, hey, with a 1.8 GPA, I mean, the only people that had graduated higher then were the ones that actually dropped out. That's how low I was, but still got into college because I played sports. And it was a very eye opening experience. I think that was the first time in my life that I really saw that I had been a big fish in a small pond the entire time and that I was actually going to go nowhere in sports. So I either had to learn something or just fail out of life, like everybody said. I ended up doing 2 years or a full year of college. And right before I was going to start my second year in college, I just up and joined the military. Again, I was saying, I don't know what I want to do. I guess my first couple years of college grades were okay. But again, I gave up the scholarships and I said, nope, just going to join the military off on a whim. And I left October 3rd, 2000, and I flew from South Dakota, where I was at. I'd gone to college over there. I was getting ready to go to college for my second year over there. And then again, I just up and left, joined the military and flew to Atlanta. And then I went to Fort Benning for my basic training. Kind of bounced around the military. I like to say I was the worst soldier ever. I had a real problem with authority. I guess the real problem was with having people in charge of me who I knew I was smarter than, but them being kind of responsible for my life. So their decisions dictating, where I would be and how I would show up and all of that stuff. So ended up going through basic training, advanced individual training. I was a medical specialist down in San Antonio, Texas. And my first duty station was actually at Fort Hood, which is now Fort Cavazos, but I will never call it that. It'll always be Fort Hood to me. I was in the 19 Cav and I ran with the mortar platoon as a combat medic. Now, when I joined the military, they said, hey, you want to be a doctor? Why don't you go ahead and be a medic? Or really, they called it a combat specialist. It was a 91 Bravo. But they kind of tricked me into joining that because there is no future in that. So if you're considering that as a life path, that's probably not the direction you need to be going in. But regardless, that's where I ended up. And during that time, as I was transitioning from advanced individual training and my first duty station, I actually ended up meeting an African American woman who I only knew for a week. And then we decided to get married. And I struggled with that in life for a very long time at why a person who had been so in control of his life decided to, throw caution to the wind and do something as stupid as that is on surface level. But anyway, at some point, I'll probably tell you the exact reason why that'll happen. For the course of my journey, we won't get into that. It's more important to know that she was African American and I've got two biracial children out of that marriage that really wasn't a marriage. But anyway, kind of made that whole prophecy of that gentleman in Vietnam true, which is why I lead with that story. But the only thing that really happened during that first couple years in the military was I was actually in the field on 9/11. We were doing training exercises, and somebody came over the radio saying, "Oh my God, the World Trade Center had been hit." And then the second one or third one came through saying, "Oh, the Pentagon had been hit." So we all kind of circled around because we heard this is not, we're not joking. This isn't training right now. Come on in. We got to have a discussion. So everybody kind of came in, and 1-9 Cav was a pretty big unit. And they told us, go grab your bag. So we grabbed our bags. We have in the military, for those of you that are in the military, you know that we were a deployable ready unit, meaning we had to have a 48-hour bag packed at any given time because we could be up and sent out. So we went and picked up our bags, sent on the tarmac for about 48 hours. And then they called it off. They said, no, you guys aren't going. You can go ahead and go back home. And then I'd say probably 3 or 4 weeks later, I actually came down on orders, oddly enough, to Hawaii, where I worked in a hospital. And that's kind of where I really found my calling. I had a mentor. He was a sergeant over there who was actually going to school for healthcare administration. And he told me, this is the perfect blend of numbers, that accounting piece, as well as medicine, the doctor piece. And when I found that out, I was like, yep, that's it. So got out of the military September 12th, 2005. And I immediately went back to school for healthcare administration. I knocked out an undergraduate degree and 2 master's degree in very short order. I didn't take any breaks. During that time, I had also had my second child. So I was a single dad, going to school, living in South Dakota. And during that time is kind of where I found maybe the second calling. Again, I was very athletic getting out of the military. I used to go down to the YMCA and play basketball in Rapid City, South Dakota. We used to go to noon ball, it was called. I don't think they have it anymore, but that's where I met some of the friends that I still have to this day. The majority of them were Native American, but we did have that one thing in common was basketball. And I kind of fell into this great group of people. And while I was going to school, getting my degrees, I wasn't working, at least for the first part of it. And we would travel around because we didn't have money. So we would play in these independent basketball tournaments. We would travel all over the Midwest. We would go to Lame Deer, Montana, or we would go to Crow Agency, or we would go to Pine Ridge, South Dakota, or Rosebud, or Eagle Butte. We just kind of bounce around and play in these tournaments. And that was during the course of all of those travels. I was the only white person there. And if you see me, which I'm sure you will at some day, you'll see I'm very fair skinned. But I was always welcome into every home that we went to. We'd always stay with a family member or stay with somebody that they knew. And there was always food to eat. There was always a place to sleep. And we always had a roof over our head everywhere we went, even in Crow Agency, which I like to tell this story because we were playing in a tournament in Crow Agency and over on the Crow reservation with the Crow people. And I didn't understand at the time, but there is this rivalry between the Crow and the Sioux, the Lakota. I mean, it's a very big rivalry. And we played in this tournament over at, again, Crow Agency, and games never start on time. I think this game probably started about 12:30 a.m. That's how far behind everybody was. So we were tired, and it was a very heated game. And it was so heated that we ended up going to blows while we were right there with these Crow boys, and we all had each other's back. So that was kind of another thing that kind of told me I'm with my people, even though again I was a white person. Crow out in that area was also the place where Custer's last stand. So being a white person out there, I'm sure that wrinkle was thrown into it as well. But it was all in good fun. We had a good time, and we got out of there with our lives. Fortunately, towards the end of my undergraduate, got that degree in healthcare management. I started working for a urological center in Rapid City, South Dakota. It's no longer around, but it was a very small practice. There were only 3 of us that were working there. There was like a manager-ish business office type person. There was me who did transcription. So in those olden days, we used to listen to the earphones and I would type, everything the doctor was saying so that we could submit it for the bills and have it for the notes that we would send back because we were a urologist center. So we were a specialist. We would send all that stuff back to the hospital after they do their consults. And I also did the front desk. So because it was a very small outfit, I got to learn pretty much every step in an outpatient clinic. The manager at the time, she had been a close family friend of my parents, but she decided to up and resign one day. And it was kind of abrupt. I really didn't understand why that was until very shortly after that, where the person who was in charge, he reached out and called me into his office. He was the remaining partner of a three partnership, the only one. He's like, "Hey, I only got about 6 months left in me. Can you just hang on with me and help me shut this practice down?" And I said, "Sure, I'll do that." So we transitioned maybe about 1,200 patients to other outfits in town, shut down the practice, and I was homeless. I really wasn't homeless, but I was jobless. I really didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. I had been dating a young lady who was Lakota, and we were sitting in McDonald's one day, and they had an old newspaper that was called the Lakota Sun Times. I think it's something different now, but it's still around. And trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And she found, back in those days, there was these job postings where they'd put it in the newspaper. So she was like, "Hey, have you ever considered working for Indian Health Services? We never have anybody that's good, and maybe it's something you could get into." I said, "Honestly, I'd never even heard about that, but I'll go ahead and do it. I'll give it a go. I'll apply for it." And that was my first role in Indian country. I worked as a clinic operations officer for the Flanders Santee Sioux tribe over in eastern South Dakota, right almost on the Minnesota border, just north of Sioux Falls, about an hour. And that opened up this whole new world to me, like this whole niche healthcare market. And I kind of fell into it. As I was working there, I got my first brush with tribal politics. I didn't really understand. I was naive at the time, but I was called into the council chambers and I was asked to let my health administrator, who was the CEO of the clinic, to let her go. I knew there had been some issues between her and the council, but I didn't really know to what extent, and they didn't really tell me. But they just said, "Hey, we need you to let her go." So I did what they said. I let her go. And then I kind of served in that capacity as that dual role, kind of the COO and the health administrator. And I did that role for close to a year before they decided to post the position again, formally post it. So here I am thinking, man, I've been doing all this good work. During that time, I mean, we increased the revenue probably 140%. I think we went from something like $1.8 million to north of three. And that was back when those encounter rates were probably 219. And that'll tell you how long ago that is, because right about now they're about 804 or 801, somewhere in that ballpark. But anyway, we did some really good work and I thought I was a shoo-in for that role. So I applied for the position and it took a very long time for them to get back. I thought we would have at least an answer back in a couple weeks, but it really drug on for a little bit. And I started to wonder why that was. But then here's the tribal politic part. They eventually came down and called me to their office and they said they were hiring somebody for that role. And I said, "Yeah, that's great. Congratulations. Who is it? What's the background?" And that individual that they hired was a family member of one of the council who had worked in an insurance company. So not a lot of clinical experience, but they were bringing this individual in. And, again, I kind of felt slighted with the industry. So I kind of sat around for a week and then I decided to submit my resignation. And I think I worked another 30 days and I think I was out of there before that individual ended up joining the organization because there was a little bit of a delay there for whatever reason. I took a short detour into for profit dialysis and I ran a dialysis center on the Rosebud Reservation right off Soldier Creek Road. For those of you that are in Rosebud, and my two kids actually lived on the res for just shy of a year in Mission, South Dakota. Very interesting place. Shout out to all my friends from Rosebud. But during that time, for-profit dialysis is very cutthroat, and I did actually get recruited away from that role, which brought me over to the West Coast by who was the competitor at the time for Fresenius Dialysis. It was the regional vice president. She flew me out to Portland, took me around, and ended up offering me a job. So the kids and I moved to Portland. Actually, before that, we moved to Eugene because that's where the clinic was based. But I got a promotion during that time and I ended up running all of the inpatient services for all of the hospitals in the Pacific Northwest region. That was Alaska Native Medical Center was one of my contracts, all the big players in Portland, all the way over in Walla Walla at a hospital out there, and then also a hospital down in Coos Bay, Oregon. So that was kind of my territory. And during that time, I opened up the first footprint into Seattle because Fresenius had been trying to get into Seattle for the longest time. And I helped them open up two programs there. I don't know if they're still around, but that's what I did during the course of that work. For profit dialysis is very interesting. And I kind of burnt myself out on that. The money is decent, but all too often I would be sitting on a call where we would value a patient by the insurance that they had. Now, in dialysis, they have what's called a coordination of benefits period. And that coordination of benefits period really basically says that, a patient will be on insurance for X amount of months and it's predetermined. I think it's 32 months or something like that. And then immediately on that following month, they would transition to a different payer, a government payer. And, for example, the reimbursement and dialysis patients are on dialysis if they're going in center 3 days per week for the rest of their life. But the reimbursements, during that coordination of benefits period is about 1,300 or 1,500 per day. So they give those patients who have better insurance priority seats. And a lot of people want to have their dialysis either first thing in the morning or, late at night. They don't want those middle of the day shifts because it just kind of wrecks a person. They can't have a life if that's the case. So all too often I would be on these calls where we would be saying, hey, patient so and so is coming up on their coordination and benefits period. They're going to be transitioning to X amount of dollars. You need to bump them from their seat and give them one of the lower preferred seats. And that just didn't make me feel good. That's not why I got into healthcare. So I ended up leaving that for profit dialysis world and started my own consulting company. And I wanted to focus on Indian country again. And that was really good. I mean, I did contracts up in Alaska, I did contracts in Idaho, did contracts in Washington. But then my company kind of grew on me a little bit and it expanded into critical access hospitals, pediatric specialty clinics. So along the way, I kind of lost my way. And then in 2018, a recruiter called and they said, hey, we've got this role in Northern California. It's running this small tribal system. And it was United Indian Health Services. So I became the CEO of United Indian Health Services right around, November 2018. I think I actually signed the contract. But I had a little bit of a delay during that time because in December of 2018, my mom passed away. And during that time, I had to go out because my mom was my dad's only caregiver. My dad was early onset dementia, and my mom died of a brain aneurysm. So it was pretty quick. So we went out and picked up my dad and brought him down to Northern California with me, where I started this new journey as um, a single dad at the time with the two kids who were in high school by that time. And then, my dad was needed a lot of help. I didn't realize it at the time. So I was doing the single dad stuff. I was doing the new CEO stuff, doing a lot of the fixing that comes with my work, the improvements, the alignment, the reorg, the restructure, the education. So it was very time consuming working more than 40 hours a week and shouldering all those other responsibilities. And it was during that time that I ended up meeting my future wife, who I had known her for a very long time. We actually met on MySpace when I was back in those basketball days and doing my homework. I would be doing my homework late at night, South Dakota time, so central time zone. And she was from Seattle. And she would be coming in from the club, feeling good, having all those drinks in her and looking to talk, and I'd be chatting with her while I was doing my homework. And if you remember MySpace, I mean, we really to this day don't even know how our paths cross. This is another one of those things that I come to find out about my life. Maybe it was that orange blinking online now. Yeah, anyway, so we had known each other since probably 2005, 2006 or so, and been friends ever since. And we'd never met each other, but we have another close personal friend who will probably be a guest on this podcast at some point. But she was kind of in the background trying to get us to at least meet each other. And again, you'll realize why that is in another episode. So I was able to get her to come down and she came down and the rest is history. We ended up getting married shortly after that. She quit her job. She was working in something with food manufacturing, something in plants, something complicated. I don't know that world too much, but she came down and we ended up getting married and she helped me with my wonderful kids and my terrible dad, which honestly didn't last that long. I think I remember it being May. My dad wanted to go back and mow his grass because he's got a property out in South Dakota, out in the Black Hills, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about that at some point too. My son drove him out from Northern California to South Dakota, and my dad ended up wanting to stay there while we were there. We had a little bit of an episode, and I really have only talked to my dad maybe once in the past, shoot, 18, 19, 20, maybe 7, 8 years, only once. And it was to really, end that relationship because it's been interesting. But anyway, we got him an in-home caregiver. He still lives in Rapid City, South Dakota to this day, and he's completely cared for out there. And then I've got two half sisters from his previous marriage who are kind of taking care of him right now. But anyway, my wife moved in, and we've been together ever since. So she's kind of bounced around with me. So I worked in Northern California for UIHS for through COVID. COVID was a very interesting time. During COVID was also when my wife graduated with her undergraduate, so I was trying to give her some opportunity. But also, as I was working in Northern California, it became clear to me that with the culture and the history, that they really needed somebody of the people to run that organization. So towards the end of my tenure, I actually transitioned over to be a contractor again. And then I mentored the young lady who is doing a phenomenal job leading that organization to this day. Liz Lara. She's awesome. So shout out to you, Liz. But then I kind of transitioned back into the consulting world. During COVID, my tribal healthcare consulting company actually made a little bit of an evolution because for the first time, tribes had a lot of money. There was a ton of money floating around. And my company actually rebranded as Indigenous Healthcare Advancements. And we started providing full solutions, A to Z care for tribal nations. And we've had tribes that have reached out, one in particular in Oregon that had been a dental clinic for 20 years. They had purchased a couple properties, one of them being an old bank building, and they asked us to build out that entire service line: behavioral health, medical, pharmacy, and also telehealth. So we built out that entire health center, everything from A to Z, hired the doctors, did the training, implemented the EMR, and then at the end of that contract, handed that off to somebody who is still running that organization to this day. But there's a story in that one as well. Another close personal friend of mine, his name is Richard Movescamp, and he's a Lakota healer from Wamblee, South Dakota. Great guy. He's also got a book, My Grandfather's Altar, that he'll probably be a person on this podcast, a guest on this as well. But as we were dedicating that property to the community, we did the ribbon cutting, we had the whole ceremony. I was taking people in, and I was given special tours of the facility before everybody got to see it, before we started seeing patients. Richard came with me, his nephew was with me as well. And we walked through that clinic. I took him through because I was proud of the work that we did there. And it's the most beautiful clinic. If you ever find yourself in Coos Bay, Oregon, Three Rivers Health Center, they have direct care services. So drop in, have a healthcare visit. But it's so beautiful. They have all the art on the walls, and all of the beds, because we only have 5,500 square feet that we were dealing with. So it's very progressive as far as flow is concerned. The beds actually weigh themselves. They transfer and transmit all of the vitals directly into the EMR. We had scribes helping the doctors. My goal was to make sure that all of those doctors, all the administrative burden was handled for them so that they could spend that time with the patient and have that visit. But anyway, we're walking through this beautiful, beautiful facility, and we get to the end, and Richard stops. And if any of you know Richard, he's a very soft spoken man. He's a man of few words, but when he speaks, he's got something to say. And he stopped me. He's like, John, this is the most beautiful building that I've ever seen. He's like, our people should be happy to receive care here. But other than a few pictures on the wall, there's nothing in this clinic that is of the culture. There's nothing that tells the people that it is a clinic for the people, by the people. And that was very impactful to me because he was exactly right. I mean, during the course of that whole project, which was probably about 24 months beginning to end, and on the front end, I was trying to get that tribe in particular to understand the importance of integrating culture into the services that we provide. But for whatever reason, it just didn't stick. That tribe that I'm talking about, they were terminated. So they were told one day that they are no longer a tribe. And then during the Reagan era, Reagan restored them. So because of that, they have that time period of disconnect to their culture. And they are very sound business people, meaning they had to adapt to the white person's way, that corporate business, to make money in order to be successful. But they struggle a little bit with understanding their foundation, their culture, their traditions. And there's a few people there in the tribe that have it, but for whatever reason, we weren't able to harness that and integrate that into the facility, into the practice, into everything that we were doing, the workflows, the being of the facility. And because of that, Richard, his statement says, because of that, the people are not going to honor this. They're not going to feel connected here. It's not going to be a place for them. It's not going to be a place that they can get health services that they can't get anywhere else in that community. So I think all of those, it was kind of the perfect storm. But I made a commitment to myself in that moment that all the projects that I do from then on were going to be led with culture. And that's kind of why this podcast is important, is to understand, at least for the delivery of healthcare in Indian country, I think that missing piece, and I think this is a missing piece for the entirety of the healthcare industry. I have said for so long that what we understand in Indian country is the missing piece for the broader healthcare puzzle. We understand culture. We understand that manifestations of illness could be misalignments in the spirit of the person. The food that we eat, the spirituality, the approach that we take to life. It could be impacting what we're dealing with, sore knee, sore neck, headache, those kind of things. So I think by the end, my goal, by the time I die, and this is one of my soapbox moments, before I die, the real healthcare industry is going to understand the value that we have, that we understand, and they're going to use or see that is the missing piece to improve the healthcare system. So hopefully I'm around long enough to see it. I really believe that I will be, but that's kind of the basis for this podcast. Where I am at currently in my life is I'm working for an urban program in downtown Los Angeles. And it's an interesting situation. It was another recruiter situation. I had been doing my consulting. We still do contracts to this day in various parts of the country, but this one in particular is unique. It's unique in the fact that it's the first time I've ever heard of a tribal health program having its funding pulled or having its status removed, meaning it was one of the 5 urban programs in the United States that had a self determination contract. But IHS ended up pulling that status. And because of that, the urban program, which serves, on paper, they say about 242,000 American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiians in Los Angeles and Orange County. I mean, on paper, we're really only serving about 3,000. And we have 11,000 on our books, but that includes our community programs as well. And we use ECW as our EMR. So regardless of whether they're coming to us for housing or whether they're coming to us for workforce, they are an active patient of our EMR, which I believe is the right way to do it. But anyway, this is an interesting one that I'm navigating right now. It says a little bit about my why and kind of what has created my perspective on leadership. I also wrote a book recently, Culture as the Operating System. It's available on Kindle right now. I'll have a link to that. And I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of those chapters in this book as we go along. Truth is Medicine is about healing, and not only clinical healing. It's about leadership. It's about approach. It's about culture. We'll probably talk about addiction, suicide, grief, sovereignty. Culture is care. Leadership is ceremony. We're going to have real conversations, and this isn't going to be a PR pitch. We have others that are in our space that are doing these things. And this is why I don't go to those large conventions, because oftentimes, there's some bits and pieces and diamonds in the rough as far as information is concerned. But, by and large, they are sales pitches. They're about trying to get you connected to them or sell you on something that you need so that they can provide you a service. But we won't be like that here. We're going to talk about the real issues, and you're going to get the raw John Reeves approach and perspective on those issues. Some of our upcoming guests, I mentioned Richard Moves Camp. I'm going to try to get him on here. I love talking to him. Every time we chat, it's just a wonderful time. I'd like to share that with you all as well. I've also got a spiritual healer in my life. Her name is Amy. We're going to have her on here as well. And I think we've got a list of a lot of other cool people. And we'll also have it open to the community. You can ask for topics. We'll have some guest ideas. You can send any questions. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this welcome to Truth as Medicine. And maybe you're able to kind of understand John Reeves and his journey a little bit more. That's about it. That's about all I got at this point in time. I look forward to seeing you in the future episodes, and thank you for dealing with my flapping of the gums, as I often say. I wish you guys a great day, and we'll see you next time.